Hello. Noah and the Great Flood is one of the most familiar of Bible stories, one that many of us have known from early childhood. Who hasn't had a little toy of an ark with wooden animals to go in it? Yet today, the biblical account of the flood, as recorded in Genesis chapters 6 to 8, is frequently dismissed as just another ancient myth without historical backing. So the aim of this talk is to demonstrate that there is in fact plenty of evidence to support the view that this story does in fact describe an actual event in the long distant past. And what is more, and perhaps more importantly, we believe the account of the flood has been included in the Bible to teach us about God's purpose of the earth and mankind. But let's first briefly remind ourselves of Noah's story as recorded in Genesis, or perhaps we should say the account of Noah, as this is more than just a story. Chapter 6 of Genesis describes how God became displeased with mankind's wicked and ungodly behaviour. And when the evil and violence became irredeemable, God announced he was going to destroy the earth with a universal flood. However, one man, Noah, pleased God and was instructed to build a large boat called the Ark that would save him, his family, and representatives of all living creatures from the forthcoming deluge. Noah diligently built this ark, and once completed, God sent rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, while at the same time water poured upwards from inside the earth, described as the opening of the fountains of the great deep in Genesis. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, their wives, along with the animals, went into the ark where they were saved from drowning in these resulting floodwaters. The flood covered the entire earth for 150 days, or about 5 months, destroying all other living things, human, animal, and plant life. After the rain had ceased and the subterranean fountains had stopped, the floodwaters gradually subsided until the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. 40 days later, Noah sent out a dove from the ark, but it returned as the waters still covered the earth. The dove was sent out again after another 7 days and returned bearing an olive branch, indicating that plant life had started growing again. Yet another 7 days and the dove was sent out and did not return. Eventually the ground dried out sufficiently for Noah, his family, and all the animals to leave the ark and begin a new life on a cleansed and purified earth. Noah is then recorded as offering sacrifices of thanks to God. Well, a very familiar story, but is there any evidence to suggest that it's true? Well, actually, there is an abundance of evidence suggesting a global cataclysm of this nature has occurred in the past. Now, we'll have to be very selective in the time available, but in summary, there are credible clues from geology, paleontology, that is the study of fossils, and folk memories that lend strong support to the biblical flood, if we are willing to be open-minded. So let's review highlights from each, starting with geology. Around the globe, we see multiple sediment layers spanning not just local areas, but across continents. For example, the chalk beds so familiar to us in southern England, in the downlands and the white cliffs of Dover that we see so often, and these can be traced right across Europe, Turkey, and as far away as the Middle East and Central Asia. Interesting, there is no signs of weathering or erosion in most rock layers that are hidden under the ground that we would expect to see if these had been gradually accumulated across millennia and had been exposed to the elements for long periods. Instead, we see smooth surfaces, suggesting the layers have been deposited rapidly after each other, for example, by a global flood. Further evidence that these sedimentary strata were laid down quickly rather than over a very long period of time is in the folds sometimes seen in them. When hard rock is bent or folded, it invariably fractures as it is brittle. However, layers of wet, still soft sediment are pliable and can be bent without cracking. A bit like wet clay can be moulded, whereas hardened clay will break if pressure is applied to it. So these unbroken layers of folded rock bear all the hallmarks of being formed relatively quickly. Geologists say at the most a few months. And we remember a few minutes ago that we said that the flood covered the entire earth for about 5 months. That, again, is an interesting connection. So these folded rocks were the result of a single catastrophic event, such as the mudslides and enormous geological disturbance that would naturally have accompanied a global flood, along with the opening of those fountains of the great deep. Moving on now to paleontology. The fossil record contained in these rock strata provide our second line of evidence for a past global flood. Fossils are often discovered in vast pockets with thousands of creatures all buried together. These so-called fossil graveyards are found throughout the world, with significant concentrations in diverse places such as Utah, Canada, Mongolia and South Africa, to name just a few. To form such concentrations of fossils would have required thick amounts of rapidly moving water, silt and sand to bury these creatures all at once before they had time to escape. The conventional view that fossils are formed when creatures die naturally, with their bones getting covered in slow accumulating sediment before being fossilized, simply doesn't explain such huge graveyards, or indeed most fossils at all. Rather, it suggests that these unfortunate animals were rapidly overtaken by a catastrophe they couldn't escape from. Perhaps these fossil graveyards, for example, were located on bits of high land that stayed dry from the flood, or the last to be flooded. It's natural, isn't it? Animals would have sought refuge on a high point before being overwhelmed by the flood. And this theory fits in well with the Genesis flood account. Moreover, fossils of sea creatures are found on top of what are now mountains, evidence that these peaks were once covered in water, and also the titanic forces of nature at work to create these mountains being thrust upwards from the earth's core. Again, this is consistent with Genesis. And finally, think of the perfect detail of animal skeletons preserved in their fossils. For example, a marine reptile called an ichthyosaur was fossilized at the moment of giving birth, with both mother and baby entombed in perfect detail in mud. In another example, in South Australia, thousands of jellyfish are perfectly preserved in a sandstone bed. This is particularly notable as, naturally speaking, jellyfish that wash up on the shore melt quickly or are destroyed by waves or are predated long before they would have had an opportunity to be fossilized. Only a sudden catastrophic avalanche could have buried these jellyfish and the ichthyosaur to form such perfect fossils. Indeed, if the skeletons of an animal that had died naturally and left on the surface of the earth, surely that would have been picked apart by predators, by vultures and so forth, and surely even if the bones had been left, they wouldn't have been naturally all ordered together in the way that they were when the animal was still alive. They would be disturbed, surely. And this brings us to our third and final type of evidence, which is social and cultural rather than scientific, but nonetheless still very striking. And it's that of the abundance of folk memories and stories that in some ways echo the account of the flood in Genesis. For example, in the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki that a great flood is coming and is told to build a boat to save himself. His entire family went aboard, along with all the animals of the field. A violent storm then ensues, lasting 6 days and nights, causing all humans outside the boat to be turned to clay. Eventually, Utnapishtim's boat lodges on Mount Nimush, where he releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven. When they fail to return, Utnapishtim leaves the ark with his family and offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the gods. Similar flood myths exist in cultures geographically diverse as Africa, Europe, the Americas, and Oceania. The details vary, but most have in common an angry God who tires of wicked humans and threatens to destroy the world by a flood, and a hero who is instructed to build a boat as a means of escape. The near universal existence of such tales suggests a common source in the distant past, which is consistent with the Bible teaching that all humans alive today are descended from Noah and therefore retain a folk memory of the great Genesis flood. Now let's turn to consider what the Bible itself has to say about the flood. Because in some ways this again is evidence for its truthfulness. Firstly, it's important to note that Jesus himself believed the flood described in Genesis was a real event. And we know that Jesus had perfect knowledge of God's way, and he wouldn't have endorsed a falsehood. For example, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 37, Jesus says to his listeners, "As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." So not only did Jesus endorse the Genesis account as historical, he drew a very important parallel with God's intervention in Noah's day and his own second coming that we are still waiting for. For the Bible's message is essentially that God will establish a worldwide kingdom under the rulership of Jesus Christ, where all the wrongs and evils in the world today will be put right. And this will be an event as momentous as Noah's flood. Peter, Jesus' friend and disciple, expanded further in his second letter, chapter 2, verse 4. He wrote, "God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust for the day of judgment." In fact, Peter explains how the ark and the flood are symbolic of the salvation that is offered through baptism into Jesus Christ. In his first letter, chapter 3, verse 18, Peter wrote, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." The divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few souls were saved through water. There is also an antitype which saves us, baptism through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Peter is saying that Jesus is like the ark. If we commit to him in baptism into his name, then we are safe from and secure from God's judgments that are coming on the world, just as Noah was safe in the ark from the great flood. Indeed, the world of today is similar in many ways to that of Noah, and God is losing patience with it and will intervene to destroy it. Not the earth itself, but the wicked human system of government that we see upon it now, just as he did in the time of Noah. And our present order of things will be replaced with God's kingdom upon this earth, ruled over by Jesus Christ. And only if we strive to follow Jesus now can we expect the reward of eternal life in that wonderful kingdom that God has promised. In conclusion then, although we've had time to just skim the surface of this deep and fascinating topic, I believe it really does provide evidence of the truth of the Bible. I would urge you to look into it further, especially the offer that God is making to you of salvation through Jesus. Don't be like Noah's contemporaries who scoffed at God, but rather have the faith and courage to enter that Christ ark that God has so graciously provided for us before it's too late and God intervenes in this world once again to overthrow this current order. Thank you for listening.